The bullet missed Eliza Sutton's head by inches, embedding itself in the wooden post behind her as she hung sheets on the laundry line, her voice carrying across the dusty yard in a melody her mother had taught her years before. She did not scream or drop the wet linen clutched in her hands. Instead, she turned slowly toward the sound of hoofbeats thundering away from her father's ranch, her song dying on her lips as she watched 3 riders disappear into the Wyoming morning, their laughter echoing back like the caw of vultures. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she finished pinning the sheet with trembling fingers before walking back to the house, her boots crunching on the sun-baked earth of June 1878. The ranch house her father had built 15 years ago stood weathered but solid against the endless blue sky, its timber walls gray from wind and sun. Eliza's father, Thomas Sutton, had carved out this piece of land near Lusk when Wyoming was still wild territory, when the railroad was just pushing through and bringing civilization with it. He had raised cattle and horses, built a modest but respectable spread. And after Eliza's mother died from fever 3 winters past, it had become just the 2 of them managing the work. Eliza had learned to rope and brand alongside the ranch hands, but she had also kept her mother's traditions alive, singing the old songs while she worked, letting music fill the silence that grief had left behind. She found her father in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. His weathered face looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and his eyes narrowed when he saw her expression. "They came back," she said simply. "Shot at me while I was hanging laundry." Thomas Sutton's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his gray beard. "The Brennan boys?" "I assume so, 3 riders heading south toward the creek." Her father straightened, his hand resting on the mare's flank. At 53, he was still strong, but Eliza had noticed him moving slower lately, favoring his left leg where an old injury sometimes pained him. "They want this land. Marcus Brennan has been buying up every ranch between here and the Hat Creek Rim, thinks he can intimidate us into selling." "We are not selling," Eliza said firmly. She was 22 years old, and this ranch was the only home she had ever known. Her mother was buried on the hill overlooking the creek. Her memories, her whole life, was rooted in this soil. "No, we are not," her father agreed. "But we may need to hire more help. I cannot watch over you and run this place properly with just old Pete and the boys." Pete McIntyre had worked for her father for a decade, along with 2 other hands, but they were stretched thin during calving season. Eliza knew her father was right, though the ranch's finances were always tight. Hiring another man would strain their resources. "Put word out in town," she said. "I will manage. I always do." Her father studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You have your mother's steel spine, but I want you to carry the rifle when you are outside. No arguments." Eliza did not argue. She had been raised practical, and survival in Wyoming territory required common sense and caution. She returned to her chores, this time with her father's Winchester leaning against the porch railing within easy reach. She sang while she worked, though more quietly now, her voice blending with the wind that swept constantly across the plains. Singing had become as natural to her as breathing. She sang while she kneaded bread, while she fed the chickens, while she mended fence lines. The melodies kept her company and kept the loneliness at bay. That afternoon, her father rode into Lusk to file a complaint with the territorial marshal and to put word out that they needed to hire a reliable hand. Eliza stayed behind working in the vegetable garden she maintained near the house. The ranch sprawled across several hundred acres with good water from the creek that ran through the property. It was prime land, which was exactly why Marcus Brennan wanted it. He was building an empire, buying up smaller ranches and consolidating power in the region. Men like her father, independent and stubborn, stood in his way. She was pulling weeds and singing a ballad about a sailor far from home when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle she had propped against the garden fence. The rider came into view slowly, his hands visible and empty, his posture relaxed in the saddle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low against the sun. A bay gelding carried him, and she could see a bedroll and saddlebags tied behind the saddle, the gear of a man traveling. He stopped at a respectful distance from the garden fence. "Afternoon, miss. I am looking for Thomas Sutton. Heard in town he might be hiring." Eliza straightened, shading her eyes against the sun to see him better. He had a strong, honest face, sun-darkened and clean-shaven except for a few days' growth of beard from travel. His eyes were a startling gray-green, like sage after rain, and they held hers steadily without the boldness she sometimes saw in men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. "He rode into town this morning," she said, "and should be back before supper." The man nodded, making no move to dismount uninvited. "I can wait, if that is acceptable. Name is Grant O'Brien. I have been working ranches up Montana way, but I am looking to settle somewhere with better winters." Despite herself, Eliza almost smiled. Wyoming winters were brutal, but perhaps not as harsh as Montana's. "You are welcome to water your horse at the trough by the barn. I am Eliza Sutton." "Obliged, Miss Sutton." He touched the brim of his hat and guided his horse toward the barn. Eliza watched him go, noting the easy way he sat his horse, the confident but not arrogant set of his shoulders. He moved like a man comfortable in his own skin, unhurried but purposeful. She could hear him talking softly to his horse as he dismounted, the low rumble of his voice carrying across the yard, though she could not make out the words. She returned to her weeding, but found herself singing a bit louder, a livelier tune her mother used to hum while cooking. She did not examine why she chose that particular song. From the corner of her eye, she saw Grant O'Brien settle himself on the bench outside the barn, giving his horse a long drink before leading it into the shade. He sat quietly patient, his hat tilted back now, watching the horizon with the watchful ease of a man accustomed to open spaces. An hour passed. Eliza finished the garden and moved to the chicken coop, scattering feed while singing a hymn she had learned in the small church in Lusk. The chickens clucked and pecked, indifferent to her melody, but she noticed Grant O'Brien had turned slightly on his bench, his attention drawn by her voice. When she glanced his way, he quickly looked back toward the road, but she had seen the expression on his face, something almost reverent, as if he had been listening to something precious. Her father returned as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, still hours from setting in the long June evening. Grant stood as Thomas Sutton rode into the yard, and Eliza watched from the porch as the two men spoke. She could not hear their words, but she saw her father's posture relax slightly, saw him nod several times, saw him finally extend his hand for Grant to shake. The decision had been made. At supper that evening, Grant O'Brien sat at their table. His hat hung respectfully on a peg by the door. Eliza had prepared venison stew with vegetables from the garden and fresh bread. She served the men, then took her own seat, folding her hands while her father said grace. "Grant comes well recommended," her father said as they ate. "Worked for the Triple Bar Ranch in Montana for 3 years. Good with horses and cattle, knows how to handle trouble." "We have had some trouble lately," Eliza said, meeting Grant's eyes across the table. "Neighbors who want our land. They shot at me this morning." Something hardened in Grant's expression, a flash of anger quickly controlled. "That will not happen again while I'm here," he said quietly. His voice was deep and steady, and Eliza believed him. "The Brennans have money and men," her father warned. "This is not a safe position." "I have dealt with land grabbers before," Grant replied. "Rich men who think they can take what they want. I prefer working for folks who built something honest." They talked logistics through the meal, where Grant would bunk with the other hands in the small cabin near the barn, what his duties would be, what the pay would amount to. Eliza mostly listened, but she found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He had good manners, thanking her for the meal, addressing her father with respect but not servility. He was probably close to 30, she guessed, old enough to have experience but still in his prime. After supper, Grant excused himself to settle in with the other ranch hands. Pete McIntyre and the two younger hands, Danny and Stewart, welcomed him easily enough. From the porch where Eliza sat watching the sunset, she could hear the low rumble of men's voices from the bunkhouse, the kind of easy conversation that men fell into when measuring each other up. "He seems capable," she said to her father, who had joined her on the porch with his pipe. "He is," Thomas agreed. "I asked around town before I came back. The barkeeper knew of him. Said he had a reputation for being steady and not backing down from a fight, but also for being fair. That is the kind of man we need right now." "Do you think the Brennans will come back?" Her father was quiet for a moment, smoke curling from his pipe into the still evening air. "Yes, they will try something else, but now we are better prepared." Eliza wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the warm evening. She felt the weight of her mother's absence acutely in moments like these, when decisions had to be made and danger loomed. Her mother had been the calm center of their family, the one who could always find the right words. Eliza tried to fill that role now, tried to be strong for her father, but sometimes the burden felt heavy. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising a hot day. Eliza rose before sunrise as always, starting the fire in the stove, mixing dough for biscuits, setting coffee to boil. She sang softly while she worked, an old tune about morning glories and new beginnings, the kitchen filled with the smell of baking bread and frying bacon, and she heard the men stirring outside, heading to the barn for the early chores. She was setting the table when Grant appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Sutton. Your father asked me to check if you needed water carried in before we head out to the south pasture." "The barrel is nearly empty," she admitted. The well was a walk from the house, and hauling water was one of the heavier chores. "I would appreciate that. Consider it done." He settled his hat back on his head and moved toward the well with an empty bucket in each hand. Eliza watched through the window as he worked, pulling up the bucket hand over hand from the deep well, filling the carry buckets, hauling them back to the house. He made 3 trips, filling her kitchen water barrel and the barrel on the back porch without complaint. Each time he passed the window, she noticed him pause briefly, as if listening, and she realized she had been singing the whole time, her voice floating through the open windows. When the men came in for breakfast, Grant's hair was damp where he had doused his head at the pump, his shirt showing dark patches of sweat despite the early hour. They ate heartily. The conversation focused on the day's work. Fences needed mending in the south pasture, and several head of cattle needed to be moved to better grazing. It would be a long day in the saddle. After they left, Eliza tackled the indoor chores, sweeping and dusting, changing linens, starting preparations for the midday meal she would bring out to the men in the field. She sang while she worked, as always, letting the music order her thoughts and keep her hands moving. The ranch demanded constant work, and she had long ago learned that singing made the labor feel less burdensome. She was kneading bread dough, flour dusting her forearms, when she heard horses approaching fast. Her blood turned cold. She wiped her hands quickly and grabbed the rifle by the door, moving to the window. 4 riders this time, not 3, and they were not bothering to hide their approach. They reined in hard in front of the house, dust billowing around the horses' hooves. Eliza recognized Marcus Brennan in the lead, a thick-set man with an elaborate mustache and expensive riding gear. His son, Jude, flanked him, along with 2 men she did not know but who had the hard look of hired guns. She stepped onto the porch with the rifle held loosely, not aimed but ready. "My father is not here. You are trespassing." Marcus Brennan leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Now, Miss Sutton, that is no way to greet neighbors. I came to make your father another offer for this place, a generous offer." "We are not selling. You have been told that before." "Every man has his price," Brennan said, "or every woman, as the case may be." He gestured around the yard. "This is a lot of work for just you and your aging father. Accidents happen on ranches, people get hurt. It would be a shame if something happened because you were too proud to accept a fair deal." The threat was barely veiled. It was barely. Eliza felt anger surge through her, burning away the fear. "Get off our land now." Jude Brennan laughed, a mean sound. "She has spirit, Pa. Maybe we should make a different kind of offer." Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut across the yard. "The lady asked you to leave." Grant O'Brien rode into view from the side of the barn, his horse moving at an easy walk, but his hand rested on the gun at his hip. Behind him came Pete and the other two hands, all armed, all with expressions that showed they would back whatever play Grant made. Marcus Brennan's face darkened. "This does not concern you, Cowboy. I am conducting business." "Any business on this ranch concerns me," Grant said quietly. He had reined in between the porch and the Brennan riders, positioning himself as a barrier. "And I believe your business is concluded. Time to ride out." For a long moment the air felt charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Eliza held her breath, her finger near the trigger of her rifle. She could see the calculation in Marcus Brennan's eyes, weighing the odds, measuring the risk. 4 against 4, but he would lose men if shooting started, and there was no guarantee of winning. "This is not over," Brennan said finally. "You are all making a mistake." He wheeled his horse around, and the others followed, galloping back toward the road with deliberate aggression, making the dust fly. Grant did not relax until they were out of sight. Then he dismounted and walked to the porch, his eyes searching Eliza's face. "Are you all right?" She realized she was shaking slightly, the adrenaline ebbing now that the danger had passed. "Yes, thank you, all of you." She included Pete and the others in her gratitude. "We heard them coming and rode back fast," Pete said. "Figured it was not a social call." Her father arrived an hour later, and when he heard what had happened, his face went pale with anger and fear. "This has gone too far. They threatened you directly, Eliza. Maybe we should consider selling, moving somewhere safer." "No." Eliza surprised herself with the vehemence in her voice. "This is our home. This is where Mama is buried. We do not let bullies win." Grant, who had been standing quietly near the door, spoke up. "If I may, sir, there is another option. We could send word to the territorial marshal's office, get a formal complaint on record. The railroad has made Wyoming more civilized than it used to be. The law has more reach now. Brennan might be rich, but he cannot afford to be seen as an outlaw, not if he wants to do business with the railroad and the cattlemen's associations." Thomas considered this. That might work, but it would take time, and Brennan could do a lot of damage before the law intervenes. "Then we protect what is ours," Grant said simply. "We post watches, we do not ride out alone, and we make it clear this ranch is not an easy target. Men like Brennan are bullies. They back down when they hit real resistance." Over the next few days, they fell into a new routine. Someone was always on watch, day and night. The men worked in pairs or groups, never alone. Eliza was not allowed outside without someone nearby, which chafed at her independent nature, but which she understood was necessary. Grant took most of the night watches, seeming to need less sleep than the other men, and Eliza often saw him from her bedroom window, a dark silhouette against the stars, patient and vigilant. During the day, when the men were working nearby, she continued her chores, and she continued to sing. She could not help herself. The music was as much a part of her as breathing, and silence felt like suffocation. She sang while she churned butter, while she tended the garden, while she mended clothes on the porch. And she noticed that Grant always seemed to position himself where he could hear her, even when his work took him to the far side of the yard. She caught him sometimes, paused in the middle of mucking a stall or fixing a fence rail, just listening, a softness in his face that transformed his usually serious expression. One afternoon, when she was hanging laundry and singing a particularly lively tune her mother had loved, Grant approached with a load of wood for the stove. He stacked it neatly on the porch, then lingered, clearly wanting to say something but hesitating. "That song," he finally said. "I have not heard it before. It is beautiful." Eliza smiled, pinning a pillowcase to the line. "My mother used to sing it. She learned it from her mother back in Ohio. I do not even know what it is called, really. Just Mama's song." "You have a gift," Grant said. And there was something in his voice, a raw honesty that made her hands still on the laundry. "Your voice. It is like nothing I have ever heard. Makes hard days easier somehow." She turned to look at him fully and found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. I sing because I cannot not sing, she said softly. It is how I make sense of the world. Then do not ever stop, he replied. For a moment they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Then Grant seemed to collect himself, nodding respectfully before walking back toward the barn. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she returned to her laundry. She had not felt this way about anyone since she was 17 and briefly courted by a merchant's son from town, a courtship that had ended when he decided ranch life was too rough and moved back east. She had thought herself past such feelings, too practical, too busy for romance. But Grant O'Brien had walked onto her father's ranch and stirred something in her that she could not name, something that grew stronger every time she caught him listening to her sing. That evening after supper, her father asked Grant to play checkers with him on the porch, a ritual Thomas had maintained with his ranch hands over the years. Eliza sat nearby with her mending basket, listening to the easy conversation between the two men. They talked about cattle prices and weather, about the best way to break a green horse, about the state of the territory now that Wyoming was pushing for statehood. Grant was well-spoken and thoughtful, and Eliza's father clearly respected him. "You have been a lot of places," Thomas observed, moving a checker piece. "What brings you to settle in Wyoming?" Grant was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I got tired of drifting. I worked ranches from Texas to Montana, but it was always temporary, always someone else's land. I have been saving my wages, thinking maybe I could afford a small spread of my own someday. Wyoming seemed like a place where a man could still build something if he worked hard enough." "It is," Thomas agreed. "Though men like Brennan make it harder for the small operators. Still, there is good land to be had if you know where to look and are not afraid of hard work." "I am not afraid of that," Grant said with a slight smile. Then, more hesitantly, "You have built something admirable here, sir, a good ranch, a fine home. Your daughter does the work of 3 people and never complains." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment, though she kept her eyes on her mending. "Eliza is the best thing her mother and I ever made," Thomas said proudly. "She has a strength that does not show itself in loud ways, but it is steel nonetheless. Any man who ends up with her will be fortunate indeed." The conversation moved on, but Eliza replayed those words in her mind as she prepared for bed later. Any man who ends up with her. Was her father hinting at something? Had he noticed the way Grant looked at her? The way she had begun to watch for him throughout the day? She lay in her narrow bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, hearing the soft footfalls of Grant taking up his watch position, and wondered what it might be like to share her life with someone like him. A week passed without incident. The men completed the fence repairs and moved cattle to summer grazing. Eliza worked through her endless list of chores, preserving early vegetables, making soap, maintaining the household, and always she sang. In the mornings, her voice was the first sound to break the dawn silence. During the day, her melodies wove through the ranch work like a bright thread. In the evenings, she hummed softer tunes while cleaning up after supper. Grant never asked her to sing, never made her feel watched in an uncomfortable way, but she was aware of him listening, aware of the peace that seemed to settle over him when he could hear her voice. She began choosing songs she thought he might like, though she would not have admitted this even to herself. She sang ballads about faraway places, love songs her mother had sung to her father, hymns that spoke of hope and homecoming. One morning, Grant brought his horse to the porch with a request. "Miss Sutton, I need to ride to the North Range today to check the water situation at the far creek. Your father suggested you might want to come along, see how the land is doing up there. It would be safer than staying here with fewer men around." Eliza hesitated. The ride would take most of the day, and she had bread to bake and 100 other tasks waiting. But the thought of a day riding through open country, away from the confines of the house and yard, was tempting. And if she was honest, the thought of spending time with Grant, away from the others, sent a thrill of anticipation through her. "Let me pack some food for midday," she said. "I will be ready in half an hour." She changed into her riding skirt and boots, tied her hair back practically, and packed a saddlebag with bread, cheese, dried apples, and a canteen of water. Her father helped her saddle her mare, a gentle chestnut named Rosie, and gave her a knowing look that she pretended not to see. The ride north took them through rolling grassland dotted with cattle, past rock outcroppings that thrust up from the earth like ancient bones, through stands of cottonwood along seasonal creeks. The morning was beautiful, the sky impossibly blue, the air crisp despite the building heat. Eliza found herself singing as they rode, the rhythm of the horses' hooves matching the tempo of her songs. Grant rode beside her, sometimes ahead when the trail narrowed, but always within sight. He did not interrupt her singing, but she could see him listening, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When she paused between songs, he would sometimes comment on the landscape or point out a hawk circling overhead, his voice blending easily with the natural sounds around them. They reached the North Creek near midday and found the water running clear and strong, good news for the summer grazing. They dismounted in the shade of a large cottonwood, letting the horses drink and rest. Eliza spread out their lunch on a flat rock, and they ate in companionable silence, watching the water flow past. "This is beautiful country," Grant said finally. "I can see why you do not want to leave it." "It is home," Eliza replied simply. "Every tree, every rock, every bend of the creek. I have ridden this land since I was a child on a pony. My mother and I used to pick wildflowers on that hill." She pointed to a rise covered in late spring blooms. "We would make crowns from them and pretend we were queens of all that we surveyed." Grant smiled at the image. "She taught you to sing?" "Yes. She said music was the voice of the soul, that it connected us to something larger than ourselves. She sang all the time, even when she was sick at the end, especially then, maybe." Eliza's throat tightened at the memory. "I sing now because it keeps her alive in a way. As long as her songs are sung, she is not really gone." "That is a beautiful way to remember her," Grant said softly. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek and the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Then Grant cleared his throat. "Miss Sutton, I hope I am not speaking out of turn, but I have to tell you something. Since I arrived at your ranch, I have found more peace than I have known in years. And it is not just the good work or your father's fair treatment. It is you, your voice, the way you move through the world with this joy even when things are hard. I find myself listening for your songs every moment, and when I hear you singing, I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to look at him and found his eyes on her, open and honest and full of something that made her breath catch. "Grant, I know I am just a hired hand," he continued quickly. "I have no right to speak of such things, but I wanted you to know. You have given me a gift without even knowing it, and I am grateful." "You are not just a hired hand," Eliza said firmly. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. His skin was warm and calloused from work, his fingers strong. "You have been a blessing to this ranch, to my father, to me. I look forward to seeing you each day. I sing more since you came, I think, because I know you are listening." Grant turned his hand to clasp hers, his grip gentle but sure. "Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I want to court you properly if you will allow it. I want to stay on this ranch and help you and your father keep it safe. And someday, if I prove myself worthy, I hope you might consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and right. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of something unlocking in her chest that she had not realized was closed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of that." Grant raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned that it made her heart soar. They sat there by the creek for a long time, hands clasped, talking about the future they might build together, about dreams and hopes and practical plans. The conversation ranged from where they might add onto the ranch house to what they would name their children someday, easy talk that felt natural because both of them knew, with the certainty that comes from something real, that they had found what they had been looking for. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and if they rode closer together than strictly necessary, the horses grazing along the trail did not comment. Eliza sang the whole way, love songs now, old ballads about faithful hearts and true love, and Grant listened as if he could never hear enough. Thomas Sutton was no fool. When they returned and he saw the glow on his daughter's face, the protective way Grant helped her dismount, and the lingering touch of their hands, he knew something had changed. That evening, Grant asked formally to speak with him, and they walked out toward the barn together while Eliza watched from the window, her hands pressed against her chest as if to keep her heart from flying away. When they returned half an hour later, both men were smiling, and Eliza knew her father had given his blessing. Grant came to her on the porch and took both her hands in his. "Your father has agreed to let me court you. He also said that when we are ready, when you are sure, he would be honored to have me as a son-in-law." Eliza laughed, a sound of pure happiness, and impulsively stood on her toes to kiss Grant's cheek. "I am sure now," she said. "But we will do this properly. Take our time. Let the ranch see that we are serious." "I am very serious," Grant assured her, his eyes crinkling at the corners with his smile. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." The next weeks passed in a golden haze of work and growing affection. Grant and Eliza courted as people did in 1878, with propriety and respect, but also with a deepening intimacy of conversation and shared moments. They rode out together when work allowed, always with her father's knowledge and permission. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing while Thomas played his harmonica and the stars wheeled overhead. Grant carved her small things, a wooden bird, a hair comb, tokens of affection that she treasured. She made him a new shirt, stitching it carefully by lamplight, embroidering his initials on the pocket where it would rest over his heart. And she sang. She sang while she worked, while she rode, while she sat with Grant in the brief moments they could steal alone. Her voice had always been beautiful, but now it took on a new quality, a richness born of happiness, of love found and returned. Grant told her once that he could listen to her voice forever and never grow tired of it, that it was the sweetest sound he had ever known. She sang for him then, a love song her mother had sung to her father on their wedding day, and when she finished, Grant had tears in his eyes. But the world outside their growing love was not at peace. Marcus Brennan had not forgotten the Sutton Ranch, and he had not forgiven being thwarted by a hired hand and a woman with a rifle. The threats continued, though more subtle now. Cattle went missing, fences were cut, supplies ordered from town mysteriously never arrived. The harassment was constant and wearing, designed to bleed them slowly rather than confront them directly. Grant and Thomas discussed filing another complaint, but the territorial marshal was weeks away and overwhelmed with cases across the vast Wyoming landscape. They were on their own, essentially, forced to guard what was theirs through vigilance and determination. The strain showed on Thomas, his face growing more lined, his limp more pronounced. Eliza worried about him, but he waved off her concerns with stubborn pride. It all came to a head on a hot July afternoon. Eliza was in the kitchen, preparing supper and singing a hymn, when she heard shouting from the barn. She grabbed the rifle and ran outside, her heart in her throat. Smoke was billowing from the hay barn, thick and black. Flames already visible through the open doors. The men were running with buckets, forming a chain from the pump to the fire, but it was spreading fast in the dry hay. Grant saw her and shouted, "Stay back! The roof is going to collapse!" But Eliza could hear something else beneath the roar of the fire, the terrified screaming of horses trapped in the nearby stable. Without thinking, she ran toward the stable door, fumbling with the latch. Grant caught up with her, grabbing her arm. "What are you doing?" "The horses!" she cried. "They will burn!" Understanding flashed in his eyes. Together they threw open the stable doors, and Grant ran inside, covering his mouth with his bandana against the smoke now pouring into the building. One by one, he led the panicked horses out, their eyes rolling white with terror. Eliza grabbed each one and led it to the far corral, away from the flames. 5 horses, 6, 7. Grant went back in each time, refusing to leave any animal to die. On the 8th trip for the last horse, a young colt too scared to move, the hay barn's roof collapsed with a sound like thunder. Flaming debris showered the stable, and Eliza screamed Grant's name. Seconds later, he emerged with the colt, both of them singed and coughing, but alive. Pete and the others had given up on the hay barn and were now wetting down the stable and the main barn, preventing the fire from spreading further. By the time the flames were finally controlled, the hay barn was a total loss, collapsed into a smoking ruin. They had lost months of stored hay, essential feed for the coming winter. The financial blow was devastating. And worse, they all knew it was not an accident. Someone had set that fire deliberately. Thomas Sutton stood looking at the destruction, his face gray with exhaustion and anger. "This has to end," he said. "I will ride to Cheyenne myself if I have to, get the governor's attention. Brennan has gone too far." But it was Grant who offered another solution. "Let me go talk to Brennan, man to man, no guns, no threats, just a conversation about what happens if this continues." "He will have you killed," Eliza protested, fear clawing at her throat. She had just found Grant, just begun to build dreams with him. The thought of losing him was unbearable. "He will not," Grant said with quiet confidence, "because I will meet him in town, in public, and I will make it clear that I have left documents with the bank explaining everything that has happened here. If anything happens to me or to this ranch, those documents get sent to Cheyenne and to the territorial newspapers. Brennan is trying to build a cattle empire. He cannot afford that kind of scrutiny, that kind of publicity. It will ruin his business prospects." It was a dangerous gamble, but it was also clever. Thomas considered it, then slowly nodded. "I will go with you." "No, sir," Grant said respectfully. "This works better if I go alone. One man, not making threats, just stating facts. If you come, it looks like weakness, like you need help. If I go alone, it is one cowboy protecting his employer and the woman he loves." He looked at Eliza as he said this, his meaning clear. The next day, Grant rode to Lusk, wearing his best shirt, the one Eliza had made him, and his gun belt strapped on not for show, but as a reminder that he was not helpless. Eliza watched him go with her heart in her throat, singing softly to herself, prayers more than songs, begging whatever power watched over the world to bring him back safely. He was gone for hours. Eliza could not settle to any task, pacing the porch, watching the road. Her father tried to comfort her, but he was as anxious as she was, though he hid it better. Pete and the other hands went about their work with unusual grimness, all of them knowing that the next few hours might determine the ranch's future. It was late afternoon when Grant finally rode back into the yard. Eliza ran to him before he could even dismount, searching his face for signs of injury or trouble. He caught her hands and squeezed them, his expression serious but not defeated. "I spoke to Brennan at his office, with his clerk and 2 of his business associates present as witnesses. I laid out everything, the shooting, the threats, the fire. I explained that I had documented all of it with the bank, with instructions to send copies to the territorial governor and the newspapers if anything happens to me or to this ranch. I also mentioned that the railroad is very interested in stability along their routes, and that violence against settlers makes them nervous about future investment in the area." "What did he say?" Thomas asked. "At first he denied everything, said I had no proof. So I told him, proof does not matter if the story gets out and damages his reputation. I told him he could have 100 ranches, but we only have this one, and we are willing to fight for it in the courts and in public opinion. I told him it was not worth his trouble, that there is plenty of land in Wyoming without making enemies of small ranchers who know how to make noise." "And?" Eliza could barely breathe. Grant's face broke into a tired smile. He backed down, not in so many words, but he implied that perhaps the misunderstandings would cease, that he respected a man who protected his own. He is a bully, and bullies respect strength. I think he realized we would be more trouble than we are worth. The relief was so overwhelming that Eliza's knees went weak. Grant caught her, holding her steady, and she buried her face against his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "You could have been killed," she whispered, "but I was not," he murmured into her hair, "and I would risk much more than that to keep you safe." The weeks that followed proved Grant right. The harassment stopped. No more fences were cut. No more cattle went missing. No more mysterious fires broke out. Word spread through the area that the Sutton Ranch was under an informal truce, and other small ranchers, emboldened by this, began pushing back against Brennan's expansion in legal and public ways. The territorial marshal's office finally sent a deputy to investigate the previous incidents, and while nothing could be proven, Brennan was put on notice that he was being watched. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one marked by hope rather than fear. The men rebuilt the hay barn better than before, and the summer passed in hard work and growing prosperity. Eliza and Grant's courtship deepened, their affection now open and acknowledged by everyone on the ranch. They talked of marriage, of when the right time might be, but both were content to let the relationship unfold naturally, savoring the joy of each day together. In late August, on a Sunday after church, Grant asked Eliza to walk with him to the creek, to the spot where they had first declared their feelings. When they reached the cottonwood tree, he took both her hands and knelt in the grass before her. "Eliza Sutton, I came to Wyoming looking for a place to belong, and I found so much more. I found purpose and home, and you, with your voice that makes the hardest days beautiful, with your courage and your kindness and your strength. I love you more than I have words to say, and I want to spend the rest of my life listening to you sing, working beside you, building a future together. Will you marry me?" Through tears of joy, Eliza pulled him to his feet and kissed him, her answer clear before she spoke it aloud. "Yes, Grant O'Brien, yes, I will marry you. I will sing at your side for all the days we have." They married in October, when the aspen trees turned gold and the air turned crisp with the promise of winter. The small church in Lusk was packed with ranchers and townspeople who had come to respect the Sutton family and their brave cowboy. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and she carried wildflowers like the ones she and her mother had picked years ago. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, proud and sad and happy all at once. Grant stood at the altar in a new suit, his gray-green eyes bright with emotion as Eliza approached. The preacher spoke the ancient words, but all Eliza could see was Grant. All Grant could see was her. When they were pronounced husband and wife, and Grant kissed her for the first time as her husband, Eliza felt complete in a way she had not since her mother died, as if all the scattered pieces of her heart had finally come home. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by neighbors and friends. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts. Thomas Sutton gave a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how his wife would have loved Eliza's choice, how Grant was the son he had always hoped for. Pete and the ranch hands presented the couple with a hand-carved hope chest, and the gifts kept coming until Eliza and Grant were overwhelmed. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, someone asked Eliza to sing. She looked at Grant, who nodded encouragingly, and she stood before the gathered crowd and sang her mother's wedding song, the one she had sung for Grant months ago by the creek. Her voice rose clear and pure into the night, and when she finished, there was not a dry eye present. Grant came to her and held her hand, and together they received the congratulations and blessings of their community. That night, in the room that had been added onto the ranch house for them, Grant held Eliza close and told her again how much he loved her, how blessed he felt, how he could not imagine his life without her. She sang softly to him love songs and lullabies until they both drifted to sleep in each other's arms, the wind whispering through the Wyoming darkness outside their window. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of work and happiness. Grant proved himself not just as a ranch hand, but as a partner in running the operation. Thomas increasingly turned over decisions to him and Eliza, content to step back and let the younger generation take the lead. The ranch prospered, the cattle multiplied, and they were able to hire 2 more hands to manage the growing operation. In the spring of 1880, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. The news filled the household with joy, especially Thomas, who looked forward to being a grandfather. Eliza continued working as long as she was able, and she never stopped singing. Her voice filled the ranch house and yard, and Grant would sometimes stop whatever he was doing just to stand and listen, marveling that this was his life, that this remarkable woman was his wife. Their son was born in December 1880, during the first big snowstorm of winter. The labor was long and difficult, and Grant wore a path in the kitchen floor with his pacing. But when he finally heard the baby's cry and was allowed into the bedroom to see Eliza and the child, he wept openly. They named him Thomas, after Eliza's father, and called him Tommy. He had Grant's eyes and Eliza's dark hair, and from the beginning he seemed to quiet most readily to his mother's singing. Grandfather Thomas doted on little Tommy, and as the boy grew, he was rarely seen without his grandfather, learning to ride almost before he could walk, trailing after the men as they worked, absorbing the rhythms and demands of ranch life. Eliza sang to him every day, teaching him the songs her mother had taught her, creating new songs about cowboys and horses and the wide Wyoming sky. 2 years later, they had a daughter, whom they named Rose, after the wildflowers that grew on the hill where Eliza and her mother used to play. Rose was a sunny child, quick to laugh and fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. She adored her older brother and followed Grant everywhere, determined to do everything Tommy did. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Grant's careful management and Thomas's experience combined to create one of the most respected operations in the region. They expanded their herd, bought additional grazing land, and built a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Other ranchers sought Grant's advice, and he became known not just as a skilled cowboy, but as a leader in the community. Marcus Brennan's empire, built on intimidation and shortcuts, eventually crumbled. He overextended himself financially, borrowed too heavily, and when a harsh winter in 1883 killed much of his herd, he could not recover. His land was sold off piece by piece, and he left Wyoming a broken man. Grant and Thomas bought one of his parcels, land that connected to their northern range and gave them control of a vital creek. It felt like justice, though neither man took pleasure in Brennan's downfall. They were too busy building their own future to dwell on the past. Thomas Sutton lived to see his grandchildren grow into capable young people. Tommy became a skilled horseman and rancher, eventually taking over much of the daily operations. Rose surprised everyone by developing a talent for the business side of ranching, keeping the books and negotiating contracts with a shrewdness that made her father laugh with pride. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1891 at the age of 66, surrounded by the family he had built and the legacy he had created. They buried him on the hill next to his wife, and Eliza sang hymns over his grave, her voice breaking but strong, carrying her father home. Grant and Eliza continued running the ranch together, partners in every sense. They had 2 more children, another boy and another girl, and the ranch house echoed with the sounds of family, laughter, and arguments, and the constant background music of Eliza's singing. She sang at every important moment, at weddings when her children married, at baptisms when grandchildren were born, at funerals when old friends passed. Her voice became a fixture of the community, and people would say that no celebration was complete without Eliza O'Brien singing. As the years passed and they grew older, Grant never tired of listening to Eliza sing. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch that had been expanded and improved over the decades, watching the sun set over land they had fought for and built upon. And Eliza would sing softly, the old songs and new ones she had composed over the years. Grant would hold her hand and listen, his weathered face peaceful, his eyes still holding that same look of wonder and love that had been there the first time he heard her voice carrying across the ranch yard. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, and the wild frontier of their youth gradually transformed into something more settled, though still rugged and beautiful. The railroad expanded, towns grew, and the harsh edges of frontier life softened somewhat, but the ranch remained solid and prospering, a testament to the vision of Thomas Sutton and the love between Grant and Eliza O'Brien. In the summer of 1910, when Grant was 62 and Eliza was 54, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party that brought family and friends from across the state. Their children and grandchildren filled the ranch house and yard, and as the evening drew on, someone asked Eliza to sing. She stood, her hair now streaked with silver but her posture still straight and proud, and sang her mother's wedding song, the one she had sung at her own wedding and at the weddings of each of her children. Her voice was not as strong as it had been at 22, but it was richer, deeper, filled with the weight of decades of love and loss, joy and sorrow, work and triumph. As she sang, Grant watched her with the same expression he had worn for 30 years, as if he was listening to the most beautiful sound in the world, as if he could listen forever and never have enough. When the song ended, he stood and took her hand, kissing her knuckles as he had done that first day by the creek. "I told you once I could listen to your voice forever," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. 30 years later, forever still is not long enough. The gathering erupted in applause and laughter and tears, and Eliza and Grant held each other, surrounded by the life they had built together, by children and grandchildren and the land they had fought for and won. The ranch stretched out around them under the vast Wyoming sky, solid and enduring, a legacy of courage and love and music. Years later, when their grandchildren asked them to tell the story of how they met, Eliza and Grant would sit side by side and share the tale. Grant would talk about riding onto a struggling ranch and hearing a voice that stopped him in his tracks, a voice singing while hanging laundry, beautiful and pure and somehow everything he had been searching for without knowing it. Eliza would smile and add that she sang because she could not sing, because music was how she made sense of the world, but that having someone truly listen, truly hear her, had changed everything. They would talk about the fight to keep the ranch, the danger and the fear, but also about the way adversity had forged them together, creating a bond that nothing could break. They would speak of compromise and partnership, of learning to work together toward common dreams, of the everyday small kindnesses that built a marriage stronger than any single grand gesture. And then Eliza would sing because that was what she did, what she had always done. And Grant would listen with that same look of peace and wonder. And the grandchildren would understand that love was not just the big moments, the proposals and weddings and dramatic rescues, but the everyday choice to be present, to listen, to honor what made each person unique and precious. Grant O'Brien died in the spring of 1918 at the age of 70 from pneumonia that followed a harsh winter. He died in his bed, in the room he had shared with Eliza for nearly 40 years, with his family around him. The last sound he heard was Eliza's voice singing a lullaby, soft and gentle, carrying him peacefully into whatever came next. She held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she did not stop singing until she was sure he was gone, until she had given him that final gift of her voice to light his way. Eliza lived another decade, continuing to help run the ranch even as her children took on more responsibility. She never stopped singing, though the songs were different now, tinged with longing and memory. She sang of the life she and Grant had built, of love that endured even through death, of gratitude for every moment they had been given together. She sang to her great-grandchildren, teaching them the old songs, passing on the legacy her mother had given her. When she died in her sleep in 1928, at the age of 72, her family buried her next to Grant on the hill overlooking the ranch, next to her parents, the family plot surrounded by wildflowers and open sky. At the funeral, her children and grandchildren sang the songs she had taught them, and their voices rose together, carrying across the land she had loved, the land she and Grant had fought for and won, the land that would continue long after they were gone. The ranch remained in the O'Brien family for generations, and the story of Grant and Eliza became family legend, told and retold, embellished and refined, but always true at its core. The story of a cowboy who heard a woman singing while she worked and knew he had found home, and the woman whose voice had drawn him like a beacon, creating a love that nothing could shake. On quiet summer evenings, some of the O'Brien descendants swear they can still hear singing carrying across the ranch yard, a woman's voice clear and beautiful, singing the old songs. Whether it is memory or something more, no one can say for sure, but the sound always brings a sense of peace, of rightness, a reminder that love built on respect and partnership, on everyday choices and extraordinary courage, creates something that endures beyond death, beyond time, woven into the very fabric of the land and the family that tends it. The ranch house, expanded and modernized over the decades, still stands. The barn has been rebuilt several times, but always in the same location. The creek still runs through the property, clear and cold from the mountains. The wildflowers still bloom on the hill where 4 generations of the family rest. And on those hills and across those meadows, the O'Brien descendants still work cattle and horses, still maintain the legacy of hard work and integrity that Grant and Eliza established. In the small museum in Lusk, there is a display about the early ranching families of the region. Among the weathered photographs and artifacts is a picture of Grant and Eliza O'Brien, taken on their 25th wedding anniversary. Grant stands tall and proud, his arm around his wife, his expression serious but his eyes kind. Eliza leans into him, a slight smile on her face, her head tilted as if she is about to sing. Below the photo, the caption reads, "Grant and Eliza O'Brien, founders of the O'Brien Ranch, established 1878, known for quality livestock and for Eliza's beautiful voice, which was said to be the most lovely sound in all of Wyoming territory." And perhaps it was. Perhaps in all the wild, rough beauty of the frontier, in all the struggle and danger and hardship of settling the West, the most remarkable thing was a woman who sang while she did her chores, finding joy and meaning in music, and the cowboy who loved her and could have listened to her voice forever.